Great, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Courey Pryor, and I'm the Executive Director of Data 2X, and I'm delighted that you all have taken the time to join us for this important conversation, especially in light of the challenging times that we are all experiencing right now. I hope that this webinar finds you and your friends and family and colleagues doing as well as possible. And I also hope that this webinar provides a 1-hour respite for you to learn and engage with our work and the work of the brilliant panelists who are here with us today. I will introduce everyone shortly, but first just want to give a few details about how this webinar is going to work. So you'll hear from 4 panelists who will share details about our new report and offer perspectives from some of the sectors that we focused on for this research. After those brief presentations, we'll open it up for Q&A from all of you. For the Q&A, just note that we're using the Zoom Q&A box to gather questions. So just feel free to go ahead and type your questions into that Q&A box at any point during the presentations. If you haven't already checked it out, our new report, which is why we're all gathering for this webinar, is called Mapping Gender Data Gaps, an SDG Era Update. And it's available on our website. And you can find it using the URL that's on your screen. I thought I'd give just a quick introduction for those of you who are not familiar with Data 2X, and if you're not, then welcome, and if you are, then welcome back. Data 2X is a technical and advocacy platform housed at the United Nations Foundation, and at Data 2X we have 2 basic functions. So the first is to build the case and mobilize action for gender data. Because gender is not a topic area that exists in a vacuum and rather touches on all domains of life, focusing on improvements here can drive quality improvement across all data systems. We also pursue direct interventions to strengthen the production and use of gender data. This includes identifying and bringing together the right partners to tackle specific data gaps, as well as stimulating relevant research in new fields, such as digital data. Data 2X believes that we cannot solve a problem that we cannot name. And so since our inception, we've been working to uncover gender data gaps and devise solutions to close them. Across the board, our goal is to draw attention to and fill gender data gaps. But of course, you can't fill the gaps if you don't know where they are. So our work started with identifying those gaps, which resulted in our original Mapping Gender Data Gaps report, which we published in 2014. And so with that, I want to introduce our first panelist, Data 2X's Senior Fellow, Mayra Buvinic, who will provide a brief overview of that original 2014 report, discuss trends in gender data gaps, and share her perspective. These are my words, not hers, but share her perspective as really one of the pioneers and the founders of the gender data movement. Mayra, over to you.
Hi, and hi, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us. And if there's a noise behind me, I cannot do anything about it. So anyway, so let me just start by saying that gender data gaps is a very long-term concern of almost half a century long. It was a core issue at International Women's Year in 1975 that launched the first decade of the United Nations Decade for Women. And you will see there the plan of action of that year, 1975, called attention to the issue, that we just did not have good measures for women's economic participation and contributions. But in the decades since, there was slow progress, with a short-lived uptick around the United Nations Conference in Beijing in 1995. But more serious attention, it really started happening only towards the end of the Millennium Development Goals, with the awareness of the shortcomings in the official statistics to measure Goal 3 at that point, which was gender equality and the women's empowerment. Measuring the Millennium Development Goals, the United Nations Data Revolution, and preparations for the Sustainable Development Goals, I think were behind the impetus for mapping gender data gaps, the report that we did in 2014. And the heightened awareness that in terms of women, there is huge data gaps, there's huge no data on women and girls, and there's also bad data on women and girls that is even more damaging than no data. In the 2014 report, what we did is we mapped gaps according to need, coverage, and policy relevance. And as you see there, we identified gaps in 5 domains: economic opportunities, education, health, human security, and political participation. And we found 28 gender data gaps. The bottom line from this report is that education and health led the way in terms of indicators having clarity, having comparability, and having coverage. Poor coverage and poor availability were in other areas, and especially for economic indicators. The indicators, and the economic indicators in particular, still do not measure women's unpaid work and badly measure women's paid work. So let's see how much we have progressed since 2014. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayra. So now that you have a background on Data2X's original deep dive into mapping gender data gaps, I'm now going to introduce Kate Grantham, our colleague and the researcher who led the work on the updated Mapping Gender Data Gaps report that we are launching today, to share some background and some highlights from that report. Kate, over to you.
Great, thanks Emily, and thanks Mayra for that excellent background on the 2014 report. So this new report really builds on Data2X's 2014 mapping exercise. And while this original work remains really foundational, incredibly comprehensive, and still relevant in many respects, so much has changed in the gender data landscape since 2014. So for starters, the entire international development agenda has shifted during this period from the MGDs to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And this brought a real increased demand for more disaggregated and nuanced data across different areas of development. So international attention itself has also shifted during this period to addressing issues that just previously weren't on our radar in the same way. So for example, in 2014, there wasn't the same global recognition that gender equality and the environment are profoundly interlinked. But despite increased attention to a greater number of issues under the SDGs and the best efforts of many experts and organizations to achieve gender data equality, so to speak, we know that many of the data gaps identified in the original report remain. New ones have emerged, and there is still so much work to be done to make women's and girls' lives visible in policymaking and in data systems. So this new report works towards creating this visibility by outlining how much progress has been made since 2014, where major gaps remain, what are the sources of gender data that are available, and what are the key efforts underway to improve gender data across the 6 domains included in this new report. So in this report, we focus on economic opportunities, education, health, human security, and public participation, just like in 2014. We also include, for the first time, environment. So in terms of methodology, to undertake this process, we started by reviewing relevant research, scholarship, and other online materials to identify what progress has been made in the past 5 years to close gender data gaps that were listed in the 2014 report. We then interviewed 20 gender experts working across civil society, academia, research institutes, think tanks, and standard-setting agencies to identify emerging gender data gaps and the key actors and initiatives working to resolve them. These individuals also very generously provided feedback on early drafts, pointing us towards kind of gaps that we hadn't seen, pointing us towards different experts that we could talk about. They were very generous with their time, and they're acknowledged in the report. So in conducting the research and in compiling our findings, we decided to focus on capturing large-scale, mostly multi-country data collection efforts, and on the data sets and sources highlighted by the experts that we interviewed. So the resulting list of gender data gaps and collection efforts that's featured in the report is not exhaustive. It represents the views of individuals and organizations working and advocating in this field on the most pressing gender data gaps in 2019, particularly in relation to the SDG monitoring framework, and we note this limitation in the report. So before I get into some of the domain-specific results, I just want to highlight some of the top-line findings to come out of the research. So across domains, basic sex disaggregation remains an issue, in part because a lot of data is collected at the household rather than the individual level. Where data is being disaggregated by sex, in-depth gender analysis of that data is not always taking place. Data that does have multiple disaggregations to account for differences based on things like income, age, disability, and so forth is relatively non-existent because of how challenging and resource intensive this data is to collect. And yet this type of intersectional analysis is really crucial to capture individuals' diverse experiences. So the research process really emphasized the complexity of data systems. It's probably no surprise to many of those attending today. But it also emphasized that no singular data source can provide insight into every facet of gendered experience. So for instance, censuses and sample surveys provide crucial snapshots of population well-being and progress, while administrative data, including from CRVS systems, civil registration and vital statistics systems, contribute essential subnational information on basic topics like birth, deaths, school enrollment, and so forth. Big data generated from cell phones, laptops, remote sensors, etc., are also increasingly being used to provide granular information about women's and girls' lives and experiences. So the research process also highlighted the multidimensional and interlinked nature of different topics and the real challenge, actually, of classifying data gaps within one domain or another. So for example, gender data gaps on women's access to land and resources is an environmental issue, but it's also related to women's economic opportunities. So where do we put that gender data gap? This is a question that came up quite a few times on different issues, and I'll speak more about this issue and how we approached it later in my remarks. So finally, the source and nature of gender data gaps really varies across domains. In some areas, such as environment, appropriate measures are still just being conceptualized. In others, where the approach to gender data is actually agreed and established internationally, gaps can arise because of a lack of prioritization, a lack of resources, or just a lack of capacity for gender data collection. So where are the gender data gaps in 2019? To answer this question, I'll now get into some of the more domain-specific findings that are presented in the report. There isn't sufficient time or interest, I imagine, to go through each gap individually. So instead, I'm just going to focus more on our process for the research in each domain and maybe some of the challenges or the more interesting findings to come out of that process. And if you have questions, I welcome further discussion into specific topics during the Q&A period. And of course, I would also refer you to read the report itself for additional information. So starting with economic opportunities, this graphic shows gender data gaps in the domain of economic opportunities, including two newly identified gaps on decent work and on aspirations and expectations, which actually refers to the more subjective dimensions of women's economic opportunities, things like agency, for instance. So there are major efforts underway to collect better gender data in this domain. So for example, since 2014, increased attention has really been paid to capturing women's time use in relation to unpaid work, as well as women's informal work, decent work, and entrepreneurship, all of which pose practical and methodological challenges for reasons we can speak to later on. But for research in this domain, we look to data sets including enterprise and agricultural censuses, population-based surveys, labor force surveys, and the growing use, as I mentioned, of big data, generated from social media, from mobile money, and from other cell phone-based applications. We interviewed experts from the World Bank, ILO, WIEGO, and ICRW, among others. And a bit later, you're actually going to get to hear from one of these experts, Kathleen Beegle from the World Bank, to share reactions to the report. Here is the list of gender data gaps for education. Now, back in 2014, under the MDGs, the goal for education was really gender equality in enrollment. Under the SDGs, the focus has shifted to look more at educational quality, learning outcomes, and social inclusion. And this is really reflected in the list of gaps shown here. Still, the lack of basic sex disaggregated data on education actually did take me by surprise. There's still so much that we don't know about girls' educational experiences and outcomes compared to boys. And the picture becomes even muddier when trying to make comparisons across countries or to understand the experiences of socially excluded girls. So for research in this domain, we looked at data sources like administrative data, so school and education ministry records, as well as household surveys and national learning assessment surveys. We also interviewed experts from organizations like UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. So as mentioned, environment is included here as a domain for the first time in this new report, with 6 gaps identified and shown here. Global recognition that women are disproportionately impacted by environmental issues is a relatively recent shift. As a result, there is little sex disaggregation or gender analysis of most environmental data, just as the environment continues to be on the periphery of a lot of gender equality work. So for this domain, we interviewed experts from UN Environment, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, and the Urban Institute, among others. And very shortly, you're going to get to hear from one of these experts, Molly Gilligan, a gender and environmental specialist and consultant who worked with IUCN for several years. So here's the list of gender data gaps for health, including 4 newly identified gaps compared to 2014. Some of the main data sources that we looked at for this domain included population-based surveys like the DHS, mixed reproductive health surveys. We also looked at administrative data from health service providers and national CRVS systems. We interviewed experts from institutions like the WHO, UNFPA, Population Council, and researchers from UC San Diego. And something significant that we noted from the research in this domain is that restricted sampling means that we know most about the health of married women of reproductive age, so that's 15 to 49 years, but we know less about children, about younger adolescents, and about older women, especially those with disabilities, LGBTQIA+ individuals, and women and girls in humanitarian settings. And that's despite that these groups may actually be more vulnerable to experiencing certain health issues. Here are our findings for gender data gaps in the domain of human security. So systematic and reliable data for many indicators of women's human security are unavailable due to the unique challenges of data collection in conflict-affected environments and on sensitive and illicit activities like violence and human trafficking. I also spoke earlier about the multi-dimensional and interlinked nature of different topics and the challenge of classifying data gaps within one domain or another. So a really clear example of this that we kind of went back and forth on internally is women's safety in public spaces, including on transit. So this is clearly a matter of human security and ultimately is included here as a gender data gap. But whether women feel safe in public also has implications for their health, for their economic opportunities, and for their public participation. So ultimately, we decided to include it in this domain, but we also made a point to identify other specific gender data gaps related to violence and to harassment across other multiple domains in this report. Lastly, here is the list of gender data gaps for public participation, including one newly identified gap, which is violence against women in politics. So unfortunately, there still is very little comparable, regularly produced data on women's representation in politics and in leadership roles at the subnational level. We also lack data on barriers to women's public participation due to, for example, a lack of national identity documentation, or as mentioned, to violence that's faced by women in politics, so the threat of violence preventing them from actually putting themselves out there in the political arena. So for research in this domain, we looked primarily at administrative data collected by governments, national electoral management bodies, and political organizations. We also looked at dedicated research conducted by academics and international organizations like the Interparliamentary Union and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. So what I've just provided here is a very high-level overview of the research process and the findings presented in the report. And I look forward, as I mentioned, to answering any questions during the Q&A period. But for now, I'll hand it back to Emily to bring the other panelists into the discussion.
Great, thank you, Kate. It's no small feat to go through all of the domains and all of the gaps in 10 minutes or so. So many thanks for that, and look forward to exploring more in the Q&A as the questions keep coming in. So now I'm really pleased to turn to Kathleen Beegle, who's the lead economist for gender at the World Bank. And Kathleen was one of the experts who contributed to our research on gender data gaps. And Kathleen, I'd like to ask if you could share your reactions to the research, specifically focusing on economic opportunities.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this wonderful work. And I think I have about 5 minutes. I'll try to be disciplined. So I have 5 minutes and I wanted to go through 5 areas of comment. I could spend 5 minutes complimenting the work. So instead, what I'm going to do is take this as an opportunity to draw some reflections on the work and make some suggestions for all of us as a community on how to look forward from this work with an eye on the economic opportunities focus. As Emily mentioned, I'm a lead economist in the gender group at the World Bank, and before that, several years earlier, I had been in the Living Standards Measurement Study team in the research group of the bank, spent a lot of time with different NSOs talking about data collection and in multi-topic household surveys in particular. So I'm coming at my comments are coming from the angle of thinking about low-income countries in particular and under-resourced statistical systems and how to kind of merge the recommendations and the findings in this work with the challenges of those settings. So let me first start by making what is maybe an obvious observation to many people, but I just want to clarify that I think a lot of the gender data gaps that the report and the different sections, not only economic opportunities, that these different themes highlight are not just gaps about not having data on women and girls. They are also places where we don't have data on men and boys either. So it's not a world where we know a lot about men and boys and we just don't know about the comparators for women and girls. And the reason this is because fundamentally I think what's often happening, not entirely, but often happening, is we don't have the surveys at all. So it's not that we're conducting a lot of surveys that are necessarily under capturing aspects of related to women and girls' economic opportunities, but we don't even have any surveys in place to say anything about any part of the population. And that's not entirely true, and I'm going to revisit that in a second. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. And that brings me to my next comment, which is on data priorities. So here, looking forward, I think it would be useful with the brain power that Data2X puts into these efforts to think going from this work to this next batch of work that you might do, could you identify what should the data priorities be and weigh the costs and the benefits? And I'll give one example. I think the space that came out clearest to me was the tension between the interest in having time use surveys and agricultural sample surveys or agricultural census data against the pressure to have more regular multi-topic household surveys. And there is a tension there because time use surveys and ag censuses are expensive to collect and often don't serve a very diverse group of policy-making decision makers, whereas the multi-topic household surveys do serve a wider audience. And even for those surveys that have a lot of backing and demand, we don't get them very regularly in a lot of low-income countries. At best, maybe once every 3 years. In some cases, like Nigeria, we could go 8 or 10 years without the main multi-topic household survey. So it would be great to think about the cost and benefit of prioritizing the big surveys that happen at the national level and to think through how to make that decision. And the third area I want to come to, which is also a recommendation area for thinking forward. What struck me about the inventory of indicators and the status of each indicator in terms of being, to get the wording right, a gap that remains unchanged, a gap that's decreased, and a newly identified gap is that many of the gaps that remain unchanged, and the newly identified gaps in particular, are areas where we are really not sure how to measure the concept. And I would love to see Data 2X help us identify where are the efforts to figure out how to measure these things that we conceptually want, but we don't know practically how to go about collecting. I list a few of them on this slide. Access to childcare. When we say access, we don't only mean who's using what at a given time, but the idea of what is the universe of options for a particular woman, for example, in terms of childcare arrangements. And that's conceptually a very difficult thing to measure. Decent work is another excellent example of this. The decent work concept has been out for, I think, at least about 10 years. And even back in 2012, when I worked on the World Development Report on Jobs, we really struggled with, in discussions with the ILO, understanding how does one even measure what decent work is? And we still haven't figured that out. How do we conceptually capture social norms on questionnaires? And how do we measure the opportunity cost to paid work, which was a point of emphasis in this new report by Data 2X. And then finally, the biggest, I think, for me, and under economic opportunities, a big elephant in the room is how do we identify the returns, the value, the monetary value of informal activities. And I'm not only talking about unpaid work in the household, but also things like microenterprise activity. We still don't know well how to measure these things. So I would love to see Data 2X help us canvas the landscape of who's working on these measurement challenges, and then all of us come together to think, how do we figure out how to measure these things, and then work actively with our national statistical offices in particular to get these concepts into the questionnaire production system and the survey production system. The fourth comment is I think the report makes a lot of great points about looking at particular subpopulations. Economic migrants was one topic that came up, refugees is another. Here we have big challenges on how to survey these populations in ways that are representative and not overly costly. There are also, I think, other challenges here that I didn't see mentioned in the report, and I want to reflect on one, which is the issue of getting consent to survey adolescent young women in particular, and also true for young men. And here we have challenges, especially if we're going to go into delicate domains related to health and sexual reproductive health. And this is something we all need to take very seriously, the human subjects and the privacy concerns dealing with minor women, even if they are engaging in very adult activities, so to speak. And then lastly, I appreciate that the report identifies the scope of the potential of big data to help fill data gaps. But I'm still left wondering, precisely what is the scope of the potential there? Because it's not entirely clear to me. We talk about mobile surveys, satellite data, internet data, but we face really big challenges identifying who is the person at the other end of that technology, and how that information can complement the really fundamental data systems that we get from our national statistical agencies. So I'd love to see sharpened clarity on that agenda. Thank you very much.
Great. Kathleen, thank you so much for those reflections and also the suggestions and input on an agenda and priorities for the future. Really appreciate that. And there's so much in what you said that I want to follow up on. So now, though, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn to our next colleague, Molly Gilligan, who's a gender and environment specialist, and as Kate said in her remarks, was a consultant for the IUCN. As you've seen, and as Kate talked about, environment was not included as a domain in our original Mapping Gaps report in 2014, but was included in this new report. And so, Molly, I'd like to turn to you to get your reactions to the report from the perspective of environment as sort of a new, in quotation marks, sector of focus for gender data and gender gaps. Molly, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Emily. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you today. Hope everyone's staying healthy and safe. And just to echo Emily's inputs, that we're very excited that environment is included in this report, in this 2019 update. So I'll give maybe a bit of background, since it might be a newer topic for some of the audience members as well. And of course, some reflections on this wonderful mapping exercise. So gender, as we've seen so far, is a cross-cutting issue across many sectors and domains, and it's also cross-cutting across environmental sectors and climate change considerations, such as water and sanitation, energy, forestry and fisheries, agriculture, disaster risk management, and women in environmental decision-making, among many other sectors. So data gaps are prevalent across these sectors when it comes to measuring the gender and environment nexus. The Data 2X mapping report highlights a few pressing data gaps with respect to decision-making, disasters, right to land and natural resources, consumption and production, and environment and health. I think this is a really strong list for where these priorities are. I would also add fisheries, conflict, and gender-based violence aspects of environmental issues as other considerations. So we've often discussed the need for data to be able to develop gender-responsive policies and to be able to convince policymakers of the importance of these topics. This is certainly true, and true in environmental sectors as well. But I will say in environmental sectors, we've actually seen a lot across environmental conventions and various strategies and action plans that there are strong gender policies that actually come first, and they advance mandates to collect gender statistics. So for example, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions have a strong gender action plan, which included trying to develop indicators and baseline data to measure gender and environment within their purview. So many international organizations like IUCN, WeDo, UN Environment, UN Women, among many others, are working to advance efforts to measure the gender and environment nexus at all levels, including in partnership with some leading national statistics offices. And Kathleen mentioned some of the challenges being faced by national statistics offices, so we'll touch on that a little bit as well. Time and time again, even with all these efforts, the prevalence of data gaps is still highlighted as a challenge. So I'll discuss IUCN's efforts to enhance data collection in a bit more detail. So IUCN developed you could go to the previous slide, please. Thank you. So IUCN developed the Environment and Gender Information Platform, the EGI. It began in 2013 as a pilot index, and a key takeaway, as we've seen again and again, is the lack of data available. So IUCN developed a methodology to create new data and analysis toward filling these gaps. The EGI aims, through data and analysis, to convey the value of gender-responsive environmental conservation and sustainable development. So IUCN produced data with various partners across various sectors, including national biodiversity plans, energy frameworks, women and environmental ministries, protected area efforts, and much more. In partnership with USAID, IUCN has also conducted innovative research with respect to energy, fisheries, the triple nexus of gender, climate, and state fragility, and gender-based violence. So you could go to the next slide, please. So as noted in the Data 2X mapping report, despite efforts to mainstream gender across SDGs, it's still pretty siloed when it comes to environmental sectors within the monitoring framework. So IUCN and UN Environment sought to develop an enhanced understanding of and enabling environment for gender and environment statistics, particularly to identify specific indicators that can gather necessary information and strategies for national action and stakeholders to work towards meeting the SDGs. So this brings me back to the challenges and opportunities. We've identified many entry points within the SDG indicators to expand the methodology to include sex disaggregated data, and we've developed a list of 19 recommended indicators that can be useful in in measuring the gender and environment nexus. Many of these are also highlighted in the Data 2X mapping exercise. So some countries and regions have been making great strides And we've learned a bit about enabling environments that can support countries as they reach towards achieving the sustainable development goals. This includes gender equality and mainstreaming laws, mandates, and policies. It includes coordination among ministries. So as Kate mentioned, there's a lot of topics that it's a challenge to decide what domain to include them in. So coordination across sectors can really support these goals. And also we find that capacity is a big challenge. So both capacity in understanding the gender and environment nexus, understanding these entry points, how these topics are connected, as well as some of the challenges that Kathleen mentioned with respect to statistical capacity and funding for surveys and data collection, as well as the follow-up to data collection, which is data analysis. So the capacity to know how to do a gender analysis is a key component of being able to utilize statistics that are developed. Great, and that's it for me.
Great, thank you so much, Molly, for that. I really appreciate it, and it's great to have the environment sector represented in this conversation, so thank you so much for joining. And thank you also to all of our panelists for the overview of the report and your reflections and your time in this process. It's truly been helpful. So I see that we do have some audience Q&A that's in the Zoom box. So now I'm going to turn this over to Nina Rabinovich-Blecker, who's Data2X's Director of Communications. She's been keeping an eye on that box, and she'll open up and moderate the Q&A. And feel free to keep sending in questions as you have them. Over to you, Nina.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you so much to all the panelists and to all the audience members who've been putting questions into the Q&A box. So I'm going to do my best now to pass some of these out to some of the panelists, and if we don't answer your question, we will do our best to get to it after the webinar. So bear with us. We'll see what we can get through in the next 15 or so minutes, and we'll take it from there. So first, Kate, I'm gonna turn it over to you. There are a few questions that have to do with how the report was sort of put together and some of the sort of things we looked at in the report. So some of these questions include how many countries were covered in this report. Also some questions about whether we looked at specific national initiatives in terms of data collection initiatives. And finally, people want to know whether a gap being significantly decreased refers to statistical significance. So if you could tackle those first.
Yeah, happy to. So in terms of the scope of the report and what we included or did not include, we weren't focused on a specific set of countries. So it was an international report. We were more focused on data collection efforts and existing data sets. And insofar as that goes, we were looking at large-scale data collection efforts. So we were looking at multi-country efforts, and often not just 5 or 6, unless they had something particularly innovative about them. So the Young Lives survey is just 5 or 6 countries, but it is a longitudinal panel, and that's quite unique. So that's one reason we might include a data set of a smaller set of countries. But oftentimes we're talking data sets that include 100 countries to 180 or so countries that actually made it into the report. So I can't say for certain that there are no national initiatives that are referenced. I don't believe there are, because we were focused on these large-scale multi-country data sets. Rather than looking at a specific set of countries, we were looking at data collection efforts. In terms of when gaps move from being gaps to being either significantly decreased or somewhat decreased, this could refer to statistical significance, but mostly what we're talking about is that a gap now has been improved because there are either international methodologies that have been established, that there is now broad country coverage of this data, or that this data is now being regularly produced, so every 5 years or so. So this is what we're talking about when we're speaking to a decrease in gender data gaps. We took a lot of our reference as a starting place to the SDG monitoring framework. So a lot of times, if there were gaps that either weren't at all, there were certain gender data that weren't at all included in the MGGs, and now they're in the SDGs. If those gaps have moved from being, tier 3 to tier 1, so no established methodologies, very poor or no country coverage, to having both of those things, that's again an example of where data gaps would have been somewhat or significantly decreased. I hope that answers the question, but I'm happy to continue talking it out.
Thank you so much. There are a number of questions that have to do with the intersectionality question. So the question of how gender intersects with other identities, how do we, what are recommendations around an intersectional approach in multiple disaggregations, and also specifically some questions about how gender and race intersects and gaps we've identified. So I'm not sure whether Kate or Mayra maybe has some insights into measuring multiple disaggregations that you can offer here.
Thank you. Let me start, and I think that Kathleen's comments are very pertinent here. And I think a big issue is, the challenge of measuring these categories. And some of you know that I'm from Latin America, and we always used to say, in terms of censuses and surveys in Latin America, that they always measured much better sort of in industrial production and the number of, roads and transport and whatever, that they measured all the diversity of ethnicities and races in Latin America. I don't know if you know, but about 33% of Latin Americans are Afro-descendants. But the challenge of measuring race and ethnicity in itself is huge. And then, that complicates tremendously the challenge of measuring the intersection, or, the interaction between race, ethnicity, and gender. It is incredibly important to do, but I think realistically, maybe we have to start with the easier in interactions to measure. And I would say that a first one, and a very important one, is just simply to measure the interaction of gender and age, and to disaggregate further the age categories. So to pick up, particularly the early adolescent girls that get not picked up, that you, in the surveys and in the data, you pick up, childhood, and you pick up the late adolescent women and the young women, but that intermediate group that is tremendously important to pick up, because interventions there can really do a lot of very, very cost-effective prevention measures. Thank you.
I'll just add really quickly that I think in a lot of ways, when we're talking about multiply disaggregated data, it's a conversation about trade-offs. So people's budgets and their time and their resources don't just automatically increase when you decide you want multiple disaggregations done. And so what often ends up happening is you go from having a very large sample with maybe just sex disaggregated data to a much smaller sample if you want some additional disaggregation done, because people need training, people need budgets and time to do this additional data collection and analysis. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. So in some cases, I think to get this type of multiply disaggregated data, we're going to have to be realistic about the trade-offs that will come with that. At least right now, it's aspirational that we would have all data intersectionally disaggregated and analyzed, and I hope that we do get there. But right now, it may be more realistic to talk about trade-offs and smaller steps.
Okay, great. There's a few questions that have come in around the environment sector specifically, or sort of crossing over questions around gender data gaps in agriculture and how these could be addressed. Also, a question from Molly, what's the best way to go about gender analysis of environment data? Are there tools and methods you recommend? And finally, a question on whether the IUCN publishes data on gender and the environment yourself. So it'd be great if we could focus on those.
Sure, great. Thank you, Nina, and thank you for the questions, everyone. So to start with, I'll talk about agriculture sector a little bit. So within the SDG framework, there are two relevant agricultural indicators. SDG 1.4.2 talks about secure tenure rights to land, and SDG 5.A.1 talk about the total agricultural population with ownership or secure rights over agricultural land by sex. So to note that this 5.8.1 is one of the only SDGs that is an environmental topic that is sex disaggregated within the official methodology. But those are both tier 2 indicators, which means that they have an agreed upon methodology, but that data is not necessarily consistently collected. So that's kind of a starting point for if we're looking at where efforts have already been made to address agricultural data gaps. These are sort of the two strongholds within the SDG framework. And I think that's important to consider because some of the other gaps that, Kate and Kathleen both brought up, the challenges of collecting data that we can have a wish list as long as we'd like. And I saw there's a question about that as well. But countries and other entities who are collecting data have to make priorities. So national statistics offices are at this point really focusing on what's already included in the SDG framework. So this gives us a strong opportunity to enhance data collection on agricultural issues, specifically surrounding land tenure and land rights. Of course, there are many other issues in the agricultural sector that would be ideal to study, including not only the land aspect, also the economic aspect. There is World Bank data on sector-specific economic opportunities. So there is information on women working in the agricultural sector, but we'd also, and again, this gets to the sort of interdisciplinary aspect of all of this, another agricultural aspect that would be great to consider in more detail has to do with health. So looking at food security and within a household, how calories are distributed. So if there's a lot more we could talk about for that, but I'll go to the next question. Hopefully I answered that one okay. So for gender analysis tools and methods, this is a great question, and I'm sure all of my colleagues would have inputs in their own sectors. For the environment, I think it's important to recognize that capacity building is a key aspect of this. So there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of work is being done on bringing better understanding to how gender and environmental issues are connected. And connecting back to the agricultural aspect, that brings up a good point of remembering that gender is not just women. Gender is men and women and every person. So there are environmental issues that impact men more strongly than they impact women, or just differently. So we're not only looking at how women are impacted, but we're looking at whole communities and how within those communities different people are being impacted differently. So for example, in agriculture, which it's useful to understand when talking about gender analysis, that I think the sort of background research is a key part of that. So for agriculture, in a drought situation, men are often more likely to be the ones to leave their communities, to leave their agricultural livelihoods and go to a city to look for economic opportunities. So for capacity building, I'll get back to that. Another key aspect is cooperation among ministries, among sectors. Often within national statistical offices, there's an environment department and there's a gender department. So even just bringing these departments together, we think the convening power of capacity building workshops is a key aspect of this, so that they can share knowledge and expertise. The environment specialists can support the gender specialists in understanding where these connections are, and often the gender the gender specialists within statistics offices have the experience to better develop the indicators and know what they're looking for a bit more, but just need the environmental support to know kind of what to look for. And that gender statistics is more than just sex disaggregated data. Gender statistics tell a whole gender story. Sex disaggregated data is a key part of that, but it goes beyond. So some of these topics, like for example, gender-based violence, you can't really develop one indicator to study gender-based environment within environmental sectors, but you can develop a suite of indicators that together can tell a more broad story of, you know, violence that women might be facing as they access resources for their family. If there's a drought, they have to walk farther for water and the dangers that come with that. I hope I answered that question a little bit, and I think there will be an opportunity to respond to more questions via email, so I can do a bit of work to see if there's a good gender analysis tool that I would be able to share as well.
Thank you so much, Molly. So we only have a couple minutes left here, and there's so many questions coming in. There were a few that I was hoping to get to, so I'm going to put them out there, and we'll see if we can get just some really quick responses. And again, we're happy to respond further over email afterwards. The three questions that I'm hoping we could sort of quickly capture. First of all, there were a few questions that came in around what does bad data mean? And also around the sort of difference between gender data gap versus data gap, which I think touches on the same issue. So hoping we can talk about that briefly. A few questions came in about the role of the private sector and how can we encourage the private sector to be collecting sex disaggregated data. And then finally, this is a lot to capture in a couple minutes, but a lot of questions about what are the next steps? How do we tackle this? What domains do we focus on? What measurement areas do we focus on? And how do we encourage other organizations, governments to be using this research and other data out there? So there's a lot, but maybe we could just do a quick round of the panelists and you can weigh in on whichever ones you want to answer, and then we can turn back to Emily.
I could just start quickly by providing an example of bad data that comes to mind for me. So one of the issues that I work on in my own research is human trafficking. And although, you know, there is data on the number of detected victims of human trafficking, this data is maybe considered bad data because it can be quite misleading. So the number of detected victims is very different than the number of actual victims of human trafficking. And oftentimes just a change in police tactics, a change in legal definitions of prostitution, whether it's criminalized or not from country to country, can have an impact on, you know, who is being captured in terms of the data, which women, which trafficking victims are being captured, is that being kind of combined with women who engage in sex trade work. So that's an example where we do have data on the number of women trafficking victims, but some of that data is not actually accurate. It can even be misleading in some cases. And in that sense, maybe it's a good example of bad data.
Can I also give an example of bad data in the kind of sphere of gender? So I think of bad data versus missing data, and bad data to me is I guess this is kind of off the cuff. I'm speaking now. Often either a issue with the sample design. So you think you're representing a particular population, but you had a lot of refusals, or you didn't do the survey in particular parts of the city, so you're misrepresenting the population. And then at other times, it's about the questionnaire and how the questionnaire is designed. And one area of bad data to me that I think we're slowly trying to correct is we collect information on work people do. We have this approach in a lot of traditional labor force surveys and multi-topic household surveys where we ask women and men in the household what type of work they did in the last 7 days. And we have these categories of what they call own account worker, which would be someone who's running a micro enterprise of some kind. They could be selling, you know, food on the corner. They could be a tailor, a brick maker. And then we have a second category, which is unpaid family worker, which is often another member of the household working in that same business. And bad data to me is when you have a questionnaire that, by the way it's designed on the questionnaire, assumes that the man in the household gets labeled the own account worker, and any female, that is his wife, gets labeled the unpaid contributing family member in that enterprise, even though we don't actually know that she has a different role in that enterprise. I mean, she could be in the enterprise equal to her husband, or she could be almost like an unpaid employee in the enterprise, but we can't differentiate because the way the questionnaire is designed doesn't give us that nuance. So we then characterize her as unpaid family worker and not as self-employed.
And if I can just add to Kathleen's explanations, and I think that's it, it's either questionnaire or problem with sample, the way questions, particularly in the past, and I think now things are improving, but economic questions were phrased in the past, made women, most women, and particularly women in low-income countries, be seen as less productive and more dependent than they really are economically. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll...
Well, I was going to ask Mayra if she could say something about getting the private sector to step up on data production and data collection for gender data gaps, because I think that's something she can speak to in the banking side.
There is huge potential there, I think, and that, you know, includes big data, particularly, you know, getting banks to produce sex disaggregated supply side data, as well as demand side data. So I think, yes, there is a huge potential, but also complications in how you work with the private sector and how you interface the private sector with the national statistical offices and the official data. Thank you.
Great. Nina, should I take us?
I think so.
Yeah. In our 1 minute left. This is Emily again, everyone. And, you know, just there's so much I could say in conclusion. I'm aware we have 1 minute left. This does bring us to the end of the webinar, and I just want to thank all of our panelists, but also all of the audience members and the really rich questions that came through. I was reading through them as well. As we've said before, we will do our best to get back on all of these questions. Just give us a little bit of time. You know, I'm struck by, you know, thinking about how we continue to need to work on the interplay between sectors, right, that are going on here. There's gaps across all. We want to understand how those, how these different questions that we have around how both women and men and all people are dealing with various challenges and whether policies are being designed for them, how those things are interacting with each other. We don't have a good sense of that because the data, because so exist in so many different sectors. And so, you know, while there's certainly a lot of work to continue to happen, I think, you know, I'm very encouraged not only by the number of people who are joining this, but I think the number of different sectors who are coming into this conversation. And just on the point about the private sector, I think we have some great examples from the financial inclusion sector, for instance, but I do see that there are more and more private sector players who are coming to this table. And I think it's about, that's because there has been more of a socialization of the issue of gender data and gender equality. And I think that everyone is seeing that this requires having private sector data producers at the table alongside and in complement to some of the work, the really important work that's happening through official statistics. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. Briefly, in terms of next steps on this work, we do have some companion reports that are coming out soon that will provide guidance for closing data gaps in specific data collection instruments for each domain. So we will be sharing those, more about that coming soon. I think part of also what all of this underlines is that because these gaps still exist, because there are needs of pushing this forward in terms of political will and technical will, some of that is going to require greater financial will as well. So just want to make everyone aware of some of the financing work that we've done with our partner Open Data Watch that really talks and looks very deeply and thoughtfully, I think, around, you know, really understanding for different data collection instruments what is the gap that we have? Because at the end of the day, if we want to close some of these gaps, it's about not just having more financing, but having better financing as well, and really thinking that through in terms of the practicalities of increasing not only the data, the gender data that we have, but the way that we're using that gender data for better policies for all. So as we said at the beginning, we did record this, so we will be getting that out to folks, and we will send it to all of you. Please feel free to spread it far and wide, as well as the report. We'll also be including a short survey in our email that comes out to you, so please do fill that out. It will be very short, but just would love to know about your interest and your appetite for this type of content, as well as your feedback. So thank you all for joining this webinar, and look forward to engaging with you virtually on this topic in the future. Have a great day.